We've already covered mitre cutting in the table saw mode, so don't propose to cover old ground except to point out the differences. In the crosscut mode, you always use the mitre gauge in the right-hand table slot. There's inadequate hand clearance in the left-hand slot, so stick to the right. And you must also always have the gauge locked by turning the pointer across the slot and locking down, and then checking that it is indeed firmly locked. Make sure your angle setting knob is also correctly locked. Now you'll find in clamping the mitre gauge to the table that you've lifted it off the V-grooves in the bottom of the guidance strips, and that could introduce a very small error in your setting. If that worries you, then tighten up the fit of the strip in the slot as you've seen. You may have noticed that I've removed my cross-cut fence, and that's a good idea when you're mitre cutting. It gives you more room on the table to move your workpiece around and to get rid of your offcuts. And the Triton mitre gauge is excellent in that you've got faces at 45 degrees and 90 degrees to the saw blade simultaneously on the one gauge. So you don't really need the cross-cut fence because you can do your mitres like this. And if, for example, you're doing architraves and skirtings around a house, you do your mitres like so, and you could do your cross-cuts like so without ever changing the angle setting. So that's a very useful feature. The only problem is we wouldn't recommend that you did mitre cuts like this, because this is where you've got the mitre gauge in front of the wood. It's better to have the mitre gauge behind the wood so that both you and the wood are pushing in the same direction. Because you'll find that in mitre cutting, especially on dense materials, there is a tendency for the wood to want to move in the direction of the saw. And you have to resist that by gripping very firmly, and that's what the sandpaper faces are for, to help you grip. You'll find that you may have to put your thumb underneath the bearing channels, but if you look down through the side guard, you'll see that it's nowhere in danger of being cut by the blade, so you can grip it quite firmly like that. And make sure when doing this cut that you don't push the saw too vigorously into the wood. Feed it very gently and smoothly, and don't pull the saw back on that offcut. You could very easily recut it. Put the offcut against the main piece and just make sure there's no sawdust in between, and then check it for fit. If there's any tendency for the joint to gape open like that at the top or the bottom, then your saw blade angle to the table might not be quite right, and you should check it. That's pretty good. I'll now just check it with a square. Yep, that's fine. That exactly adds up to 90 degrees, which means I had my gauge set exactly 45. Now, just as in the table saw mode, when you're in the cross-cut mode, you can dial up the correct mitre gauge setting, and you can use the complementary faces of the gauge, which are both at 90 degrees to each other, to achieve perfect mitres. It's very important when mitre cutting that you give yourself good support close to where you're going to be cutting. For example, cutting off this face is fine because the wood's supported right up to this point and the saw blade goes through here. Cutting off this face is not fine because there's this huge unsupported area of wood, and there will be a tendency for the wood to rock about this corner of the mitre gauge. So your options are to use this face, or perhaps use this face to get the right angle, or you might even have to take the mitre gauge out of the slot, turn it around through 180 degrees and put it back in, but you can always get a position where you've got good support for your wood right next to the point where it's going to be cut. If you decide to fit MDF sub-fences to your mitre gauge upstands by a couple of screws through there, they're a really good idea because firstly they give you a sighting position. You know exactly where your saw blade is going to pass when you cut that off with your first cut, and you can line a pencil mark up against it for future cuts. Also, you can attach stop blocks to this to cut to exactly the same length, but we do recommend that you put sandpaper on the face of it to increase your grip. The most typical application of using the mitre gauge in the crosscut mode is when you're cutting long, heavy, awkward pieces which might be too big and unwieldy to cut in the table saw mode, such as staircase stringers or long length of architrave. Well, by all means cut them in the cross-cut mode, but you might find that the upstand on the mitre gauge is actually a little bit too short to give you good support for a big, long, unwieldy piece. So I've used the mitre gauge to set my angle for this parallel-sided piece of scrap, which I've G-clamped the table, but you could just as easily screw it to the mitre gauge, and that's now at the correct angle and gives me a good, solid support for my big, heavy, unwieldy pieces. Do make sure that you make this piece wide enough so that when you cut into it a short distance, as you will do in cutting through your workpiece, that cut doesn't substantially weaken the piece and affect your support. A very common application of the cross-cut mode is building fences and gates. And here's a useful cut. These two pieces, taped or clamped together, were rebaited at an angle of about 17.5 degrees with the saw blade raised to cut only halfway through. And then when you put them together, they form a lovely, strong, halved crossover joint. It goes in like so for your gates. This is an interesting joint. It's called the half-lap mitre joint. This piece started out square cut, and then it was put against the 45-degree face of the mitre gauge, saw blade raised to half the depth, and a series of cuts created a halved 45-degree section. This piece started off cut through at 45 degrees, then it was put against the zero face of the mitre gauge, and again halved square to this edge. And then when you put the two pieces together, you get all the beauty of a mitre joint from the front and the strength of a lap joint. So that's a very useful, strong and attractive joint to use in your woodworking.